So this Friday will mark the one-year anniversary of Russia's so-called invasion of Ukraine. Over the past year, America has spent more than $100 billion financing the Ukraine side of this war. We're poised to spend hundreds of billions more. Both Biden and the McCarthy-led congressional GOP are on board with it because naturally, it's easy when it's other people's money and a bunch of it gets skimmed off by your friends and your donors. But the same hazards, the very same hazards that existed in the beginning of all of this, still exist right now. Our fake leaders in the corporate government crime syndicate are intentionally walking our country toward a nuclear World War III over a country that isn't even our ally. A country whose territorial integrity means absolutely nothing for our own liberty or security or prosperity. You all remember, we were promised that our involvement could stay limited enough to prevent escalation. We were only going to supply a little bit of cash and some small weapons like missiles and rifles and drones, already far too much. But now we're sending Ukraine heavy artillery. We're sending Bradley fighting vehicles. We're even sending Abrams battle tanks. Hell, soon we might be sending them advanced fighter jets. Keep in mind, dozens of bioweapons labs have been discovered and confirmed by our own State Department to exist in Ukraine. And guess what? It looks like they're tied directly to the Biden crime family. Nothing good happens in bioweapons labs. And by the way, Putin seems to be strategically including those facilities as his primary targets. Meanwhile, you want to talk about war crimes, the Ukrainian Azov battalion is literally eating opposition soldiers, and the global pedophilia cabal has plenty to cover up in Ukraine, a country that, remember, was primarily settled by Russians after Lenin's color revolution defined arbitrary borders in the former Soviet Union. What the hell is really going on here? Well, as of a few weeks ago, we also have detailed reporting indicating that we are committing our own acts of war directly against Russia. According to veteran investigative reporter Seymour Hersh, the Biden administration used Navy divers to blow up the Nord Stream pipeline in the Baltic Sea. That's an act of war against Russia. And it's even an act of war against Germany, our own supposed ally. So expand this a little bit. At first, China stayed out of all of this. Well, now it's looking more and more like they see that our obsession with Ukraine is a perfect opportunity to weaken and humiliate us further. In the last few weeks, they allegedly sent these balloons to test our air defenses. Now they're reportedly considering sending Russia weapons to bolster their war effort. Of course, they're already waging all kinds of indirect war on us right here in America. Since our own border matters a lot less than Ukraine's, tons of Chinese fentanyl pours over it and eventually reaches the arms of American drug users. More Americans are dying of drug ODs every year than were killed in the entire Vietnam War. China is also flooding our schools and laboratories and cutting-edge companies with spies. They're stealing every type of technology that they can get away with. And who knows, maybe China will decide that it's worth risking a real war with us. They want Taiwan back. They know that America's weapons stockpiles are more depleted now than they've ever been at any time since World War II. They know that our European allies are totally focused on Russia and won't bother with some fight in the Pacific. And they know that we have a president who's already bought off and owned, so is his son Hunter. So maybe they're thinking, if we're going to fight, now is the time to do it. And if they do, let's face it, they would be right. Taiwan matters more than Ukraine does. Not that that's saying much, but Taiwan is also not a country worth fighting a nuclear war over. So that's why this is all so insane. We're inching closer and closer to real, full-blown, kinetic World War III, and it's all on behalf of countries and causes that shouldn't be our concern at all. So what's the real reason for all of this? Consider testimony from Joseph Spencer, who was a U.S. government employee from May of 1970 to October of 1997 as a secret operative in an organization called Men in Black. Quote, "In 2024, there will be an alien invasion on Earth, but in fact, the inhabitants of the Earth will not see an armada of real ships in the sky, but a very advanced hologram that looks like a real object and can even be touched. The absolute reality of what is happening will be created, but it will not be aliens or holograms that will bomb cities, but Earthlings under the cover of these holograms. The world will witness a massive alien invasion. Thousands of holographic alien warships will cover the skies, but people will be in a global panic, and real warplanes between holograms will deliver the real blow. As a result, a one-world government will be created, and none of the people will be against it. Unquote. Dale Comstock spent 10 years in the Delta Force as a ballistics and explosive expert. He joins us now. Dale, thank you so much for coming. We appreciate it.
Hey, thanks for having me on. Appreciate that. Yeah, a lot of things you just said there make the hair stand up on my neck. You know, I'm in Florida right now, but I also live in Indonesia and in the Philippines. I travel quite a bit. So I kind of get to see both hemispheres and what's going on both sides of the globe. And I have a pretty good perspective, I think, as far as how we're viewed, how we view the world, and how the world views us. I've always said that we've been at war with China for a long time. It just hasn't gone kinetic. It may never go kinetic. They're doing a pretty good job at winning under the radar. You know, I mean, you know, and the problem is most Americans are completely ignorant, oblivious to what's going on. They don't care because it doesn't affect their daily lives. They don't pay attention. But the reality is, you know, things like TikTok, right? You know, it's a psyops tool, and it's used for surveillance and for spying by the Chinese. We've got the balloons, you know, flying across our country. You know, balloons have been around since the 1800s. They've been used in, you know, many ways, whether it's surveillance or whether it's actual attacks, dropping bombs and things like that. We use them in Afghanistan as tethered balloons. We have free floating balloons. We have maneuverable balloons. They have them. The Chinese and Russians have them. And here we are. We're letting we're letting people come across the borders unchecked. And now, from what I understand, there's quite a few Chinese coming across the border. We're allowing chemical weapons, fentanyl, to come across the border. I mean, it's an amazing. I mean, think about this. You know, Biden quoted 70,000 deaths. It's actually probably closer to 100,000 deaths from fentanyl every year. And think about if 100,000 people died every year, you know, from airplane crashes. You know, we'd be losing our minds right now. But nobody's paying attention. Nobody cares because it directly doesn't affect them per se, other than maybe if they lost a loved one or something. We have balloons coming across the border unchecked. You know, so it's a balloon. So what? Yeah, well, how about this? You know, it's a balloon that's, you know, obviously it's a surveillance balloon. It's probably tracking our signals. You know, there's a lot of intel to be collected from that. You know, what about this? You know, like the Japanese in World War II. What if they just start dropping a weapon, a nuclear weapon, a small nuclear weapon, maybe, you know, chemical weapons, bioweapons, radiological weapons. You know, what if they introduce an EMP? All right. And basically wipe out our electrical grids. I mean, there's so many things they can do with that. And if we just allow them to come across unchecked, cross our country before we shoot them down, what's the point? You know, they've already collected the intel. You know, do you think they're actually keeping it in a recorder and they're going to recover the recorder later on? No, they've actually been downloading this stuff as a balloon's coming across our country. So they should have never even entered to begin with. So this administration particularly has left all our borders, our air borders, our sea borders, our ground borders, all wide open. And we're getting exposed to a threat, and people aren't paying attention, like you said. Eventually, what's going to happen? One day, you're going to wake up and have nothing. And you know, and like what's his name, Schwab from the World Economic Forum said, you'll be happy, like baloney. You'll have nothing. You'll own nothing. You'll do nothing. You'll go nowhere. Everything. You will lose all sovereignty and all control. So the Chinese don't have to kill us. I don't think that's their goal. They just have to control us and our resources, and we're making it really easy for them.
Nobody's more owned by China, the CCP, than the Biden crime family. He definitely owes some favors over there. We don't even have any real proof that that balloon was sent by the Chinese anyways. We can consider an article from 2008 maybe, or 3 years ago, I think it was. The United States government announced their balloon spy program to try to shut down narcotics activity. They were going to launch, by the way, from South Dakota, float over parts of the Midwest, and then make their final in Illinois. This could have very easily been launched by our own government. And speaking of being launched by our own government, you were in the Delta Force as a ballistics and explosives expert. What about this Chernobyl event in Ohio that the media completely ignores for 10 days until programs like this one started putting the pressure on them to report it because millions of people suddenly started learning about it? Now we had an explosive device in Philadelphia placed on train tracks targeting another train. Nobody knows where this pipe bomb came from, but oddly enough, Dale, it matches the same one that was supposedly placed at the RNC and the DNC on January 6th. And that person was caught on video, but yet not a primary target of the FBI. They would rather go get grandma and grandpa who prayed on the Capitol building steps on January 6th. Do you see this as a rogue government that it's at war with its own people?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I've been saying this for a while. They ignore the obvious threats that are out there. I think it's called mass hypnosis psychosis. Look at over here. Look at the shiny things that's going on. Look at this. Oh, racism, bad cops, blah, blah, blah. So nobody's paying attention to, these train wrecks, literally to the tune of about 1,000 a year in our country where trains are coming derailed. And we're just kind of ignoring that. Yet, I've as a security consultant as well over the years, I've done a lot of work with explosives, different types of breaching mechanisms and procedures, methodologies. But I've always concerned myself with, if I was a bad guy, how would I do the most damage psychologically anyways, in America? If I wanted to really invoke terrorism, what can I do? And one of the ideas was using a train. You could take maybe a quarter pound of C4. You can make homemade explosives. Very simple. The menus are on the internet, and basically put it on a piece of railroad tie, put a cap on. As soon as the train drives over, it detonates. You take the train right off the rails, and now you have what? A train going 100 miles an hour, spilling chemicals and debris, maybe into water sources, a river, going over a bridge, plowing through a village, a city, a town.
And that's exactly what's happening in Ohio right now. We have all of this vinyl chloride, which is a known carcinogen to every single organ in the human body, going directly into the Ohio River, which is a water source for 5 million people, the largest tributary into the Mississippi River, affecting everybody south of that in the lower Mississippi. This is actually happening. The media is completely ignoring it. Meanwhile, food plants, manufacturing facilities, chicken farms are all up in a blaze. The country is literally on fire, and nobody seems to know or give a damn.
It's amazing, right? It really is amazing. The dumb masses, the Roman Empire, collapsed because they said, give the dumb masses bread and circus, and they won't pay attention to what's happening in the Senate. And you see how that worked out. Here we are again doing the same thing, because reality is, and I like Elon Musk, what he said one time, he said, quote, you can buy an education, but you can't buy intelligence. And man, there's so much truth to that. There's some really smart people out there academically that are dumber than a rock, and they're naive. They're gullible. They've lived in the box all their life, and they just don't believe, the government would do that to us. Oh yeah, they will. I've been in part of the government. I've seen what the government is willing to do. I've seen the lies. I've seen the covers up. I've directly seen them. Okay. I know what it's capable of. And if anybody thinks out there that the government is here to protect you, you're smoking crack. Or maybe fentanyl now, but we live in a dangerous time, and I don't see it getting any better unless this regime is changed. And let's just hope, man, that somebody with some common sense gets back at the helm and steers us in the right direction. Because I don't know that America, honestly, the real America doesn't even exist anymore. Not the one that I grew up in. My father fought for, I fought for, my son fought for, my kids fought, all my children fought for, literally fought for. We don't recognize it anymore. And it's sad because, I worry about my children in this country. What are they going to inherit? What are they inheriting? And what about their freedom? They're losing it. My only, I don't know if I'm not going to say I'm lucky, but at least I have another plan. I live in Indonesia as well. Not that it's that much greater, but I'll honestly tell you, it doesn't have the problems we have in our country.
That's right.
I have a fallback plan, so to speak, but that's not to argue that I'm going to try to run either, because I will actually stand and fight for my country. It'll be the last fight I ever fight, but I will fight for my country and our freedom, whatever it takes. But, I'm just totally disgusted. And you're right. None of this is accidental. None of this is coincidental. You got one live brain cell. You do your critical thinking, your analysis. No doubt what is going on is deliberate. Every part of it, not just on a national level, but on an international level. There is literally a conspiracy to basically undermine our sovereignty, take away our freedom, and basically enslave us all. Under one world government. There will be the haves and the have-nots, and there's going to be just a few of the haves and a whole lot of us in the have-not barrel on the bottom, if we even survive it.
George Carlin said it best. It's a big club, and we're not in it. You mentioned mass formation psychosis. That, I think, blames the people. And really who we need to be blaming are the people who control the media, BlackRock and Vanguard and the criminal central banking cabal and big pharma. And the criminal media, the press, lies to people. They brainwash them while they're busy at soccer practice and putting food on the table and working their 9-to-5 job. Blue-collar America, the backbone of our economy. These people are absolute criminals. And you mentioned getting the right person back at the helm. We can't wait on a man to ride in on a white horse and save us. We as Americans need to realize what our duty is to our country. And we would be derelict in that duty as Americans if we did not tear down and abolish any form of government that's oppressive to our inherent, God-given, inalienable rights. And that's exactly what's happening before us right now, every day. I got to get to break. Dale Comstock, thank you so much for being here. Come back again soon.
Appreciate it, brother. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, sure, of course.
Welcome back to Neil Oliver Live. Now, the long-expected Russian spring offensive in Ukraine is underway, NATO reported last week. The eastern city of Bakhmut, among others in the east, has been under attack, and observers warn the Russian effort will be widely spread with multiple targets. On the 8th of February, Ukrainian President Zelensky spoke in Westminster Hall and asked for British fighter jets for his pilots. Prime Minister Rishi Sunak and Labour leader Keir Starmer had earlier spoken in the Commons about their commitment to supporting Ukraine until victory is achieved. Just what are the prospects for the Ukraine in the days, weeks and months ahead? To consider that question is my next guest, retired US Colonel Douglas Macgregor, a decorated combat veteran and former advisor to the Secretary of Defence in the Trump administration. Good evening, Colonel. Thanks for joining me.
Sure.
First of all, Colonel, what is your assessment of the war in Ukraine at this time?
Right now, you have in and around Ukraine roughly 700,000 Russian troops. The major body of these troops are located down in southern Ukraine and in western Russia. Most of these troops are new in the sense that they're mobilized or recruited, but they are all commanded by experienced combat veterans. In front of them right now are highly elite light infantry formations backed by massive strike assets, clearing the remaining areas through which these massive forces will shortly pass. It's almost finished, not quite. Bakhmut, which has been under attack for months and has literally bled the Ukrainian army white, is close to being annihilated. But other than that, most of these forces are ready to go. It's simply a question of when the general staff in Moscow gives the green light. And by the way, their targets for their missile strikes have changed dramatically. They've stripped away virtually all the remaining air defense that the Ukrainians have.
Now, there are voices out there all around calling for greater involvement in Ukraine by NATO countries, almost up to and including boots on the ground and so on. How do you react to that?
Well, I think we're suffering from a narrative that was promulgated early through the media by this ruling class that you've been discussing with your guests. And the ruling class has tried to convince everyone that Russia is the evil empire that is striking helpless Ukraine. In reality, we spent the last 8 years building up a force in Ukraine whose entire purpose was to attack and destroy Russia, focusing mainly on eastern Ukraine and then Crimea. The Russians saw this threat metastasizing and realized it was only a matter of time until American theater ballistic missiles and short-range missiles showed up in eastern Ukraine. And so they intervened. They intervened with the goal of convincing us that we should negotiate and that the Ukrainians should back down. We would not negotiate. In fact, we prevented the Ukrainians from negotiating, and we have insisted on this long war. Russia had to make a decision. Would it cut its losses and get out, or would it finish the fight? It couldn't cut its losses and get out because there's an existential threat in eastern Ukraine to Russia. So they've decided to annihilate it. And this phase of the operation is designed to effectively secure all the territory east of the Dnieper River. I imagine subsequent phases will move west of the river. How far they go and what they do will depend entirely on whether or not we finally recognize that we cannot help Ukraine win. We are not going to win this fight. The Russians will.
Greg, how do you, bear with me, Colonel, while I bring in Greg Swenson, who's here in the studio with me. How do you react to what the Colonel is saying there, Greg?
Well, I think what the Colonel's saying is in contrast to what we're hearing in the media. And so I'm not sure whether to believe the media and, because the idea that was promulgated, as Colonel Macgregor said, was that the Russians are the invaders here, and Ukraine are just defending their country. But that's, we just don't know what if this narrative that was developed by the media is true or not. There hasn't been any debate. And that's, I think, the biggest problem here is that the elites in both countries, in the U.S. and the U.K., decided right out of the gates that, this was the most important issue, and we saw Mitch McConnell say this last week, this is the most important crisis for America. Meanwhile, there are much bigger problems in America than this one, as far as Americans are concerned. So there's some really different arguments here.
Colonel McGregor, I'm sure you're listening to that. Also, I mentioned in my introduction to you that Rishi Sunak, the British PM, and Keir Starmer, the opposition leader, have committed to staying with Ukraine until victory. And there's now going to be fighter jets supplied to Ukraine, long-range missiles. What are the implications for NATO if Britain keeps nudging closer and closer to what certainly sounds like war, direct war with Russia?
Well, the English-speaking countries have fully embraced this false narrative about Russia and Ukraine. They staged the coup and installed a government in Kiev, which was, from its inception, fundamentally hostile and anti-Russian. The war that we're now witnessing was cultivated over many years, not just over the last 8. Certainly the deaths of 14,000 people in eastern Ukraine as a result of Ukrainian aggression against the Russians in their own country was part of it. But this has been a long-term process that has now put the Russians in the position of fighting an existential threat. For Russia, Ukraine's membership in NATO means that it becomes a permanent platform for attack against Russia. They will not tolerate that. They have no choice but to fight this to the finish. Most Europeans, I think, are completely disinterested in fighting this war. I'd be surprised if most people in Britain necessarily want conscription to be announced and tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of British troops to be sent to the continent to fight the Russians. I think the Russians will fight this to the bitter end, right up to the Polish border. And if we continue to fight from Poland, then Poland will become part of the war. This is a catastrophe for NATO. NATO is not going to survive this experience. It will crumble. That's already happening behind the scenes. And Germany, of course, sits at the center of all of this. And the Germans have absolutely no interest in a war with Russia any more than most of the rest of Europeans do.
Molly Kingsley, listening to the Colonel there, do you feel that there's a whole massive part of this long and complicated story that we simply haven't been invited to know about, far less to discuss?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's been, I think, very conveniently painted as a simple black and white issue that actually it's become very difficult to argue against. Zelensky good, this hero, Putin terrible war criminal. Obviously, we're doing this. Let's not debate it. Let's not talk about it. And I say convenient because it is convenient for our leaders, because it means that they can blame this war for so many of our domestic ills that in fact had nothing to do with the war. So, if you look in absolute terms at the money spent on lockdown, which has crippled our country, destroyed our public services, and which we are nowhere near, reclaiming that ground than we were a year ago or a year and a half ago. But, yet it's the war in Ukraine, and that just doesn't add up, actually, if you look at the sums of money. But it's painting it in black and white allows this cloak of, obviously it's the right thing to do, it can't be argued against, and it's closing down the debate on it. And there needs to be debate because it's playing roulette with all our futures.
Colonel McGregor, do you think we are? Do you think Europe is? Are we moving closer to, I hate to say it, but a World War III type scenario? Are we walking without the proper debate and involvement of the populations upon whom all this would impact, being informed and being invited to have an opinion?
Well, there's been no debate in your country or in mine because the ruling elite controls everything. They control finance, they control the media, and they control the government. So there has been no debate. People are being presented with this false narrative. and told, well, we have to go do this because Russia presents a great threat. The truth is that there was no threat from Russia whatsoever. And these people never bothered to point out that the Russians initially went in with very few forces in a very restrained manner. And this led people to conclude that the Russians were weak and incompetent, which of course was wrong. But they can't have it both ways. If Russia is weak and incompetent, it's no threat. Now, today, that's being reversed dramatically, and suddenly Russia is regaining its former military power faster than anyone anticipated. And the Russian economy is in infinitely better shape than yours and most of Europe's economies. So I think we're headed to something. I don't think it's World War III. I think we're going to watch, ultimately, as Europeans remove this ruling class from power across Europe and hopefully at some point in your country. And I think we'll see something similar here because the interests of the people are simply not represented.
Colonel Douglas Macgregor, retired. It's such an important conversation. I wish we had longer to spend on it, but thank you so much for your time this evening and bringing to bear your experience and your insight. Thank you so much.